Hi everyone, my name is Ken Ford. I'm super psyched on this Whitewater Museum idea you've got, and I just wanted to share a little bit of my experience with these sorts of museums for canoeing and kayaking, and some of what I've learned in whitewater history in recent years. So part of why I'm doing this too is to learn how this program works. So I want to share some of the lessons. Some of this is from the film I did, The Call of the River. It's about a 90-minute documentary film, and it captures canoeing and kayaking primarily, and a little taste of whitewater rafting, and just a bit of everything involved in whitewater sport over that length of time. For this film, we did 50 interviews, had 50 sources of video footage, and 50 roughly sources of still footage as well. The film, as I mentioned, doesn't cover that much on whitewater rafting, but we did have opportunity to get a pretty good archive of some footage of Walt Blackadar, who was a rafter before he was a famed kayaker. And we got some pretty good archives, I believe. Well, this was from Will Perry in Carbondale, and I believe it's one of the CRMS trips, I'm guessing on Cataract, although they thought maybe it was on Browns Canyon too, but that looks like a beach on Cataract to me. Early 70s. Some of y'all probably know Dave Demery and his wife Mimi. This was in their early days. We also got a pretty amazing archive for this project from the filming of the movie Deliverance. This is on the Chattooga River. This is the Deliverance film crew running Sock 'em Dog, which is pretty full, or Corkscrew Rapid, which is pretty full-on Class 5. And you'll notice they're running it without oars. They were just pushed in at the top, and their way of dealing with it at the bottom was jumping out and having people swim them to shore. Pretty crazy, camera and all. Of course, that spurred the whole Deliverance syndrome and many, many deaths back east. But on to some museums. This is one of the museums we went to. This is the Canadian Canoe Museum. It's located near Toronto, in Peterborough, Canada, and it's amazing. They have about 100 boats on display on the museum floor, and I believe another 200 in an adjacent warehouse. It's clearly the state of the art for canoe kayak museums anyway. Here's a little sampling of what they have in the indigenous kayak realm. They got some pretty amazing 1700s, 1600s canoes as well. One of the interesting things I found from there is that some of the most important parts of their museum were the photographs, because that really captured the days of the sport, and even the paintings and illustrations of the sport before cameras. The fur trappers, of course, hunters, all had a huge impact on the birth of canoe sport. But again, another example of how the posters help tell the story. These canoes for $32 for a 13-foot boat. Pretty cool. That speaks of history. And photos of regattas in the lake country where people would gather for really competitions. You can see in some of the fine print here, they're jousting from their canoes. These were well-attended events. And canoes really took a front and center role. This boat has a record player in it, a phonograph. It was for courting the opposite sex. Some of my other work on museums more recently was with the Whitewater Kayak World Championships that were held in Western Maryland in September this last year. And as part of that World Championships, we got a big, huge tent in the vendor area, and we put together a pretty cool little last-second display, a traveling display for the spectators during breaks in the competition and that sort of thing. We We tried to emphasize a real variety in the boats and tried to capture a little bit of what the sport was like in the early days. We had interpretation that was sort of printed up and done by local college, and this was all done pretty last second. And I'm really sorry that we didn't have with us a big old box trailer to put it all in, because then we would have had a traveling museum for the future. And by the way, that yellow boat back there, some of y'all may recognize that. That's the first plastic kayak ever made, and in fact, that's the first one off the mold from Tom Johnson, the holoform. We had little displays of gear, so on. Speakers area where people could give little presentations and films and that sort of thing. The Grumman canoe and what it gradually evolved to, the deck canoe. You'll notice that we tried to really emphasize photographs, because the photographs really tell a lot more of a story than the boats themselves and the gear themselves. Like the Grumman, the nymph of the Whitewater, or Jimmy Carter in the Grumman canoe. But this was really put together by just a small group of us, and pretty big old circus tent, and it turned out pretty well. I was psyched on it. But I think it, to me, showed that there's real need and value for traveling museums that can dovetail with additional events that are going on, other river events and festivals and that sort of thing. Another museum I know of, and this, I'm going to start down sort of a list of other museums I've seen. This one's in Augsburg, Germany. Well, this photo is from Augsburg, Germany, from the 1972 Olympics, but they have a pretty good museum as part of their Whitewater Park. The International Whitewater Hall of Fame has sort of gone a different direction. They tend to have nothing but an online presence. And I think that is increasing, that people will have virtual museums of one sort or another. This is from the Powell Museum. Of course, you all know of it. You probably know of the Grand Canyon River Heritage Museum effort on the South Rim. I think this is largely Tom Martin, but the dream is to have a river museum on the South Rim. You can, they do in fact already have the Kirschbaum kayak on display. That was the first kayak ever to run the Grand. And they have video footage from that, oh boy, it must be 1952 trip down the Grand, something like that. Another museum that's tangentially related, I guess, is the Antique Boat Museum from Clayton, New York. Interestingly, right across from Niagara Falls, pretty much from the Peterborough Canoe Museum. The Antique Boat Museum tends towards a little bit more varied type of boat, but they do have a good canoe kayaks, canoe sailing sort of thing. The Wooden Boat Museum, Newfoundland. A lot of these East Coast museums stress quite a bit of boat building workshops and things to sort of keep the heritage alive. Small Boat Museum. This one's in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. The Kayak Canoe Museum on Lincoln Street in Portland, Oregon. I've not been there, but hope to get there this year. It's relatively new and pretty cool. A lot of sort of Greenland sea kayak heritage there. So a couple of things I've learned over the process of doing my film and then doing some other projects is that you can have pretty high impact with some low effort on a couple, specific sorts of projects. You all probably know the Salida Museum. I call it a museum, but it's just the wall with boats up against it. That's probably the most photographed part of Salida, Colorado. It's crazy, but even though there's zero interpretation or signage or anything, it does sort of tell a story of where the sport's been. I think from the worlds, I really figured out that it would be awesome to get a traveling museum for whitewater canoe and kayaking, and maybe whitewater canoe, kayak, and raft is the right sort of mix. I think a traveling museum would be popular and gain supporters for something more permanent. Another big lesson I learned was that photos tell the story. And I was taught this by Norm Billingham, who's until recently was the CEO of the United States Olympic Committee in Colorado Springs. And part of his job was giving VIPs tours of the halls of the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs. And they, as you might imagine, they've got gold medals on the walls, and they've got track cleats that have won gold medals, and they've got all sorts of memorabilia. But Norm said that really the memorabilia doesn't do much. The photographs that you can build stories around is a more critical part of the museum experience. And I certainly remember as being a kid going to Native American museums, and those dioramas really captivated me way more than one little pot would, or one little trinket. So here are a couple photos to end on. Folding kayaks being put together in a train in 1937 on the Housatonic River right outside New York. People take the train from New York City, put together the boats in the train car, and then pass them out at the next stop and get out and float. I think this picture tells a lot about how the sport was held back by materials. Of course, throughout the many, many decades, people had a lot of fun tying boats on their cars for their shuttles. And then finally, I think there's a space for disruptive museums. Everyone talks about how all different parts of society are getting disrupted by technology. Well, we have a wide open possibility for web-based archives and traveling museums and traveling speakers bureaus and that sort of thing, which are great bang for the buck for museum efforts. So anyway, that's my 2 cents. Be happy to answer any questions, and thanks very much for your interest, and we'll see you down the road. Let me know if you have any questions. Okay, thanks. Again, it's Kentford it's wkentford@gmail.com. Okay, thank you.